From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Urban Outlook.
And good morning and welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you for being with us today. The August 9th events of Ferguson, Missouri, as you know, the shooting of Michael Brown by a white police officer has sparked a series of emotions, from anger to sadness to disbelief about whether history is repeating itself. Protests have happened not just in Missouri, but countrywide, including here in Nashville. It's causing conversations from the White House to the church house, some would say. Shannon Royster sat down with a civil rights advocate to talk about the impact of Ferguson, not just on the community there in Missouri, but right here in Middle Tennessee. Take a look.
It's been more than a week now, and protests in the streets of Ferguson continue.
This time, black community is trying to wake up.
It's all in response to the shooting death of unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown by a white police officer.
Started calling what happened in Ferguson lynching or continuation of lynching by the police.
And civil rights leader Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. says it stems from the violence of racism, something he knows all too well after leading peaceful lunch counter sit-ins in downtown Nashville in the 50s and 60s.
The movement of which I was a part with Dr. King and Rosa Parks and many others did not go on long enough to get at the issue of violence and racism.
But Reverend Lawson says the people of Ferguson are going about it in the wrong way.
They will exhaust themselves.
He says they need to come up with a plan they can sustain and not place blame.
Seek to understand it enough to map out a short-term, long-term program for it to be eradicated. You don't eradicate this kind of structural violence of 300 or 400 years overnight, and especially you don't eradicate it when so many people see it as justified.
Which Lawson believes will take more than the people in Ferguson to make a difference.
The business of unwrapping our humanity and getting the dominant forces in our society to acknowledge our common humanity is the task of every generation. And the task has never been finished in the United States. It's a mistake for so many people to think that it has.
That was News Channel 5's Shannon Royster reporting. Of course, as I said, these protests in Missouri have caused all sorts of conversations across the country. And one person that always has a perspective on things for us is Dr. Reavis Mitchell, who's the Fisk University Professor, historian himself, chair of that department there from time to time, and probably still is, I bet, over there.
Actually,
you've had a number of titles over there.
I'm not chair of the department. Dr. Jennifer Adebanjo is.
Okay.
I'm Dean of the School of Humanities.
Dean of School of Humanities. Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, for being with us. And of course, you saw the piece that Shannon did and heard the comments from Mr. Lawson as well. And also, you've been watching the newscast,
Yes,
I'm sure, and been participating in a number of these conversations.
And reading and staying on Twitter and getting online.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So many saying this is just history repeating itself. It's happening way too often, always going back to some of the roots of what has always happened to our people. What's your take on this?
It's history repeating itself, but it's in a very different world. It's in a world of mass communication and instant communication. We probably should have learned something from the Arab Spring to see nations fall almost instantly from protests from individuals, from citizens, and especially in a country where we believe that citizens have the right to act out. The sad story, 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement, you had that piece with Reverend Dr. James Lawson. We thought America had learned its lesson. We thought after 300 years of slavery and almost 100 years of forced segregation that America would learn its lesson. And while the masses may have, the powers haven't. Policing power in America was the only difference between the clip from the 1960s and the clip at Ferguson was that the police were better armed. The police treated it like a military attack against citizens, against the right to protest. It's a sad time in America. We've set ourselves up as the cultural leaders of the world. When things go wrong someplace, they think the United States will come in and make them right. Whether it's in the Arab world, whether it's in the desert, whether it's in Ukraine, people depend upon us, and then we respond in that way to our own people.
Interesting point of view there from Dr. Lawson, that, you know, the protests aren't really what should be happening, that people will exhaust themselves,
That's
I
right.
think was the
That's
word
right.
that he used, that we really need to have a solid plan. But when these things continue happening, I think we've had at least five deaths of unarmed black men killed by police officers in the past month, not just Michael Brown in Missouri,
Exactly.
but a number of others. This just pushes people to the point of wanting to do something and doing it fast, and sometimes that comes out to be a protest.
And when you're responding to terrorism, and as a black man, I can tell you when I see that, when I studied history, we think terrorism is something that happened somewhere else, but lynching was terrorism. What happened to Michael Brown was terrorism. Because the point is, for the rest of the world to see that, it's what happened to Mr. Brown, what happened to young Mr. Brown can happen to you, can happen to your son if you get out of place. And that's what the world's going to have a problem with, and that's the problem we face here in the United States.
So what should our plan be from your perspective? Looking at what has happened through history, what advances we've made, a couple of steps back along the way when these kinds of events happen, what should be our plan of attack now?
It must be dialogue. People must get to know each other, whatever. Systematic racism, legally we think is dead, but as long as there's a perception that young black men are terrorists, that they must be fired upon by the police. I can't say enough about sensitivity training for police officers. And finally, we've got to look at the systemic problem with violence in this country and ask why are we violent, and we must respond with handguns. We're the only nation in the world where our not the only, but one of the few great nations where our police arm themselves and overarm themselves. And when our police don't have enough firepower, the community comes forward and raises funds to increase the firepower of the police. And in this charged society, with these young people today, it's a different world than the 1950s. Young people, black and white, Asian, Hispanic, all young people hold you accountable for your actions. And if you're unaccountable, if they don't understand why, they're going to respond. I don't know how you change that. I don't know if you really want to change that, but you must be sensitive to the world we're living in today.
Sounds like an education piece on both sides of the
Certainly
fence,
does.
though,
It
because
certainly
I can
does.
remember a piece a while back. It was called The Law in You, and I think law enforcement officers put it together along with an insurance company, and they were trying to teach young people how to respond when they're approached by officers. Now, we don't know what's right or wrong, right, and what happened in that situation, but we know there are some things we can do to make sure we're respectful and maybe not get in that situation.
Authority figures must carry themselves in a way that's respectful.
Gotcha.
And we must respect authority. I tell the story all the time. As a child, my grandmother told me, if something happens, find the policeman. As I try, find the policeman. I don't know if parents can still tell their children that. I don't know if we can't give them. So the police, authority figures, must rise to the challenge of presenting themselves as authority figures, but also as human beings. I get upset sometimes when people talk about role modeling, because I always ask the question, well, who was Du Bois's role model? Who was Jesus Christ's role model? But policing must become role modeling. They must set an environment where people feel comfortable, not where people feel threatened.
There was an article in the Washington Post. It was actually an AP piece called "Can Ferguson Change the Ritual of Black Deaths?" I don't know if you had a chance to see that, and I'll read just a little excerpt from it. It said, "The choir sang, the preacher shouted, and the casket stayed closed. The body was taken to a cemetery, and Michael Brown was laid to rest. Thus went the most recent enactment of the ritual, the script of death, outrage, spin, and mourning that America follows when an unarmed black male is killed by police." And then it asks a series of questions. You know, will this ritual ever change? What do you say?
I'm reminded of the words of Rodney King. Why come we just can't live together? You know, and whose responsibility is that to ensure that all Americans have justice? It's difficult in a society where when the President of the United States is addressing the Congress, someone will yell out, "You lie." Then you see respect lost at the very top. It's so easy to criticize, and it seems appropriate and welcome to criticize young black males. That's not right. That's wrong. You can't classify people because of the way they wear their hair or a hoodie they have on. And certainly authority figures must be sensitive to that, and they can't appear to be hunting them down. They can't appear to be a vigilante. Felt like he was right in hunting down a young man in the community as a suspicious character because he was young, black, and wore a hoodie. Trayvon Martin. Not right.
Right. Dr. Mitchell, we have gotten together on these kinds of events before. It's a sad thing that we have to have a conversation around these, but it continues to happen. Do you see change with this latest event? We always say, let's sit at the table, let's have the conversation, let's both sides get together and figure this thing out. Do you see this happening anytime soon?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. In the United States of America, we believe that all things are possible. I constantly tell people, I still believe there's no better place in the world to live than the United States, but we must work out our problems. Citizens must work out their problems. Authority must work out their problems. There must be, as you said, a dialogue, a conversation. And it doesn't just happen on TV. It happens in homes. It happens in churches. There's a discussion of violence before there's violence, not post-violence.
Absolutely, because that conversation was had at my dinner table. I'm a mom of a young black son as well,
Yes.
and I don't want him to be faced with these challenges out there in the world and find himself in a situation like Mr. Brown did.
I find it wonderful. I'm teaching a course at Fisk called The Black Experience. And what I found most interesting yesterday was that black women of the generation, they see just as many perception problems with the perfect image, with whatever, and they feel castigated also. So we must address that within our culture.
Dr. Mitchell, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, let's keep the conversation going. We will talk to some other folks who have been part of this discussion, part of the protest even, making a trip and being part of the things that are going on around this latest situation. We'll be right back after this.